This book contains accounts of stalking, harassment, doxing, threats, and invasion of privacy. If you are affected by these topics, please consider pausing and seeking support from trusted friends, a counselor, or local authorities. You are not to blame. I started saving screenshots because I couldn't stop myself. At first, it was idle curiosity, an under-moderated corner of a forum where strangers unspooled the smallest betrayals of ordinary days. A message that arrived at 3 a.m., a car that always seemed parked 2 houses down, a door key that no longer fit just once. Those tiny shavings of unease accumulated into a pattern. I opened a text file, pasted a line, then another, until a file grew into a folder and a folder into a habit. The more I read, the more I recognized the same motifs. A reflected window, a coffee mug placed where it shouldn't be, a receipt with an address, a number that called and hung up. Glass and light, numbers and objects. The motifs threaded themselves through different lives. I'm not the victim in all these accounts. I never claimed to be. I became the collector, the reluctant archivist of other people's fear. I recorded the dates people remembered, the words they quoted, the institutional responses they found or didn't find. Then, when the pattern became too loud to ignore, I started reaching back to ask for details or clarification. And almost without exception, people trusted me with more. They told me what they'd tried, calling security, changing their schedule, printing logs, confronting the person who denied everything. Some told me what helped, some told me what didn't. In each story, the ordinary day fractured into a trouble that could not be wished away. The first story I kept began at a bus stop. I was told how she would sit on the bench, fingers wrapped around a warm paper cup, the smell of instant coffee and rain, and watch the windshield reflections of stranger faces. For almost 2 weeks, the same man in a blue jacket boarded the bus behind her, always a seat away, always stepping off 2 stops later to cross the road and follow the same block until she disappeared into her building. She changed her route, took a different line, only to find him again at the grocery store. Small things escalated. A folded note left on her windshield with a time and a single word, wait. A receipt from a cafe she never entered found under her mailbox. She reported it to transit police. The patrols were polite but thin. They asked for times and license plate numbers she did not have. She began to document photos of the bus stop, timestamps on her phone, where she had been each night. One afternoon, the man called her number from a blocked line and said his name and the exact color of the scarf she'd worn that morning. The police added the report to a file. The transit authority installed "Report Suspicious Behavior." It felt like a bandage. Eventually, she changed shifts at work, moved her evening walks to mornings, bought a small doorbell camera, and joined a neighborhood safety group. The man stopped crossing her path. She never knew if he'd been arrested or moved away. What remained was the shard, the image of her reflection in the bus shelter glass and the knowledge that someone had studied it. Another account came from someone who worked nights in a hospital. He was a nurse, steady hands, a habit of counting his keys twice before he locked the locker room. A name he had thought of as harmless, an online admirer who commented on every photo on a community feed, morphed into something else when he found a single Polaroid tucked under his locker with his initials penciled across the back. The Polaroid showed the shadow of his bicycle in the parking lot at 5 in the morning. He checked cameras. Security said they had nothing, or that footage had been overwritten according to policy. HR gave him a pamphlet, how to file a complaint, whom to call. He kept copies of the Polaroid, scanned it, put one in a bank safety deposit box and another in his drawer at home. He changed shifts for 2 weeks. He printed out his staff badge log to see who had signed in near his locker. He learned to ask the night charge nurse for an escort to the parking lot. At his best friend's insistence, he filed a police report. The detective listened and logged it, promised to check if any other complaints matched. Months later, a coworker recognized the handwriting on a different note and the hospital revoked a contractor's access badge. The contractor was questioned and denied anything beyond being a fan. No charges stuck. The nurse stopped cycling at dawn. He started parking under a different light. He slept with the Polaroid in a drawer, and the smell of antiseptic sometimes mixed with the ghost of that parking lot shadow in his dreams. One voice wrote to me from a campus dormitory. She had been a student with a slow, deliberate laugh and a stack of overdue library books by her bed. She described a semester of small humiliations that fed into a larger violation. It started with packages left at her door, free stickers, a keychain, nothing offensive, but always with a handwritten note that began, "I notice." Then someone left a single hair tie on her pillow. The campus police took reports, but said there had been prank calls and harmless stalkers before. Her resident advisor was kind but overworked. She installed nightlights and moved her desk away from the window. She found comfort in a friend who agreed to walk with her to class for a week. Then she received a private message on a forum, a screenshot of a group chat where her picture and a list of places she frequented had been posted, titled Routes. She printed the message, saved the metadata, and took the screenshot to campus police. The administration opened a harassment case and issued a no-contact notice to a student. The alleged sender ignored it. Months later, he showed up at a lecture. He was told to stay away, and he received a disciplinary hearing. The hearing resulted in a probation and mandatory counseling. The school's privacy office offered relocation to another dorm, which she accepted. She never felt the same at the cafeteria window, seeing reflections of people who might read her routine like a map. A server told me about being doxxed after a night shift dispute with a customer. He had argued about a tip and later found a spreadsheet posted on a public forum with his first name, an incomplete phone number, and a list of his scheduled shifts at the restaurant. Friends at work banned the forum, installed privacy locks on the staff Facebook group, and the manager called to apologize for the public schedule. They changed how the rota was distributed. The owner spoke to the staff about safety and suggested varying arrival times. The server received threatening messages through a burner account and then a call where no one spoke. He blocked numbers, documented the messages, and reported to the local police, who advised him to preserve all communications. The restaurant offered to change his shifts and arranged an extra employee at closing times so no one left alone. That was practical help. The less practical part was the way the sight of a clipboard with the week's schedule made his hands go cold. He took to stapling his paycheck to the back of his wallet, a small ritual that felt like control. In a quieter town, a hiker described being followed on a trail. She wrote about the forest sounds, wind in the pines, the distant clack of a gator against rock, and how they were suddenly punctuated by the irregular rhythm of footsteps behind her when she paused to drink. She had always liked walking alone. Nature was where she felt steady. At first, she assumed another hiker, then realized the same backpack strap glinting in the late sun appeared at every turn. She stopped taking the side trails she loved and joined a local hiking group whose members recorded her route for a week until the presence faded. She reported the behavior to the park rangers, who admitted there was little they could do without a name or a photo, but they did increase weekend patrols and recommended she hike with partners when possible. Months later, she found a crumpled map with a circle around her favorite ridge and the date she usually ran. She kept the map in a drawer and stopped running alone at dusk. The forest remained beautiful. The trust she used to have in its silence had a new edge. An IT consultant told me how her online life was weaponized. She specialized in usability testing and often posted casual photos online.
From work events. For months, an anonymous account would comment with praise that felt invasive, what she wore, the city she preferred, the name of a coffee shop. It escalated to login attempts on her email from unusual locations. She changed passwords, turned on two-factor authentication, and reported the unauthorized logins to the service provider, who locked suspicious sessions. She did not describe the method, she described the effect, a sleepless night scanning a list of devices she did not recognize, the hollow feeling of someone standing just outside the glass of her life. She hired a discreet security audit through a company recommended by a friend. They found a weak point in a backup email she'd used years prior and advised updating recovery contacts. The harassment stopped after a series of takedown requests filed for accounts impersonating her. The legal route was slow and emotionally expensive. The consultant said she had to work through a shame that felt like a personal failure even though she had done everything right. A mother wrote about her toddler's preschool photo appearing on a forum with a caption that invited strangers to guess where the family lived. The image had been taken at an open church fair, one of those community days where 100 phones snapped the same square of sunlight and short pants. She contacted the forum moderators, who removed the post and banned the account. She called the preschool, which tightened its photo sharing policy, and asked parents to sign an updated consent form. The preschool principal called the police as a precaution and shared the incident with other schools in the district. Still, for weeks, every time she looked at her child's backpack, she felt the prickle of being watched. She installed a privacy screen on the home router, not because she thought the attacker could hack them, but because it felt like an extra latch on the door of their small life. One man, a teacher, described the slow unraveling after a former student began leaving messages at his classroom door. Small notes folded in the cracks, compliments that shifted into possessive demands. He kept the notes in a box and photographed them for evidence. The school administration put him on leave while they investigated, both to protect him and to defuse the situation. The student was suspended, then referred for counseling. The teacher felt ambushed by the very system meant to protect him. Leave was paid, but the rumors that rippled through colleagues and parents were not. He returned after the disciplinary process, but with tighter procedures for classroom doors and a security monitor at pickup time. He taught the same lessons, but with his back against the window, facing the board, a small change that gave him sightlines he hadn't considered necessary before. A freelance illustrator found her identity stolen in a way that struck at the heart of her livelihood. Somebody set up a fake portfolio site offering commissions under her name, sending preliminary invoices and compliments.
Collecting deposits that never translated into work. She lost both money and trust. She documented every transaction, reported the site to its host, and filed complaints with payment platforms used on the scam. Payment processors froze accounts after paperwork. She compiled emails showing the impersonation and presented them to a lawyer, who sent cease and desist letters. The fake pages disappeared, reappeared under a different domain, and vanished again. The repeat appeared like a hydra. Cut one head, another would surface. Her income dipped. She took a job for stability and learned to flag clients who asked for private messages on unfamiliar platforms. She started watermarking work and used a brand signature she could change if needed. The signature became a talisman. A woman working at a small tech startup woke to find a spreadsheet leaked that contained employees' emergency contact names and partial addresses, something an attacker apparently copied from a misconfigured internal drive. The company did not deny the leak. Human Resources emailed apologies and offered credit monitoring for a year. The startup's security engineer was mortified and instituted an access audit, but by then the data had been mirrored and cached on external sites. The woman found that community members on a forum had posted screenshots and debated whether to redact and share. She reported the posts and requested takedowns. The company compensated some employees for credit freezes and reissued ID badges. She moved to a company with stricter policies a year later, but the awareness of her personal life being cataloged lingered like a faint strobe light. Her phone felt less private. She kept fewer photos and fewer contacts. A delivery driver told a story about being followed from job to job. He described the cracked vinyl seat of his van, the tinny radio station that played during long drops, and the way a sedan would appear at the same light ahead of him at every turn. He started recording license plate numbers on a small pad, but one night someone smashed the side mirror on his van. He reported vandalism to the police and to his employer. The company increased depot lighting, assigned him to team deliveries in the evening for a while, and reimbursed him for repairs. The police officer who took his report mentioned other complaints about a late-night prowler in the same area. Nothing immediate brought the person in custody. Over time, the presence ebbed, possibly because a neighbor's motion sensor camera captured the prowler's silhouette, and that clip was shown at a neighborhood watch meeting. The driver patched the mirror himself and learned to park under floodlights, a small adaptation with a persistent taste of shame. A grad student in psychology described how an experiment she shared on a public repository was repurposed into a thread where anonymous commenters parsed tiny details from her methods section to deduce a campus room number and the times she worked. She altered the preprints metadata, removed personal anecdotes, and reported the thread. The university's IT security team reached out, offered to scrub public records, and to register a privacy complaint. They suggested adjusting her online profiles and not using the campus room identifier in future publications. The department instituted a new protocol for thesis metadata. The student learned to anonymize future postings but carried the uncanny sense of exposure. Academic transparency had opened a window someone else had peered through. One of the most chilling accounts came from a woman whose ex-partner created multiple fake accounts to gaslight and harass her after a breakup. He posted intimate details and fabricated stories, creating a chorus of voices that questioned her credibility. She described the slow, invasive erosion of trust, where friends started asking questions about the posts and she felt compelled to prove details of her life repeatedly. She documented the harassment, screenshot by screenshot, and shared it with a lawyer who helped her obtain a protective order. The order limited the ex-partner's contact, and moderators across platforms removed the fabricated profiles as violations of terms of service. Even after legal protections, the aftermath lingered. Invitations evaporated, private messages filed with accusations that she couldn't easily refute. The courts offered an outcome but did not restore what had been lost. A barista recounted waking up to a voicemail that simply breathed. The number was untraceable. She changed her voicemail settings and spoke to the manager about closing procedures. The cafe installed a security camera at the back door. A patron later recognized a man from the tape and flagged him to the manager. Management banned him from the premises. The barista slept differently afterward, more alert to the sound of someone heavier than a late-night patron at the alley gate. She learned to trust the backup of multiple coworkers. When one couldn't walk her to the train, another would. Mutual aid felt like armor. A nurse practitioner told of a patient who became obsessed, learning schedules and showing up outside her clinic. She filed a complaint, requested a safety assessment, and her clinic put in place a policy to never release clinicians' schedules publicly. The clinic consulted legal counsel and filed for a restraining order. The patient was treated and periodically monitored. The woman switched exam rooms and asked reception to never announce her by full name in the waiting room. The measures were practical and imperfect, and she spoke openly about therapy she sought to work through the fear that had seeped into her hands while working. The last account I saved was the closest to home for me. It began with a message on the forum addressed to someone with a username I recognized. Someone who had posted a photo of their kitchen window months earlier and joked about the way light fell on their sink. The message was benign at first, a compliment. Then it moved to a description of their habits, laundry times, weekend runs, the brand of tea. The poster responded that it made them uncomfortable and closed comments, but the original account had already.
They mirrored a photo with the house number faintly visible in the reflection of a glass. They blurred the photo and reported it to the platform. Moderators responded slowly. The thread had been copied. Eventually, a neighbor, alerted by a friend who saw the thread, recognized the house and called the police. The police visited, took statements, and the platform took the images down after repeated requests. The neighbor installed a reflective film on the glass, and the homeowner moved a chair out of the window. The feeling of being surveilled remained. The half-second of a reflection. The thought that anyone with an internet connection could find the angle and build a map of daily habits. That was the horror people kept returning to. The idea that casual glimpses could be turned into an organizing principle for someone else's fixation. Across these accounts, the institutional responses varied wildly. Some police departments took reports seriously and logged patterns. Others treated the complaints as low priority until an escalated act forced attention. Security teams sometimes moved quickly, revoking access badges, changing camera retention policies, or implementing escorts, while in other workplaces administrators deferred to privacy concerns or budget constraints. Moderators on forums and platforms removed doxing posts after repeated requests, but caches and mirrors often kept the damage alive. Legal remedies, restraining orders, cease and desist letters, takedowns worked in part but rarely sweetened the aftertaste of exposure. There were common practical threads that emerged from people's choices. They documented obsessively: screenshots, timestamps, printed notes. They sought witnesses, friends, co-workers, neighbors who could corroborate presence. They used institutional avenues, filing reports with police, HR, transit authorities, platform moderation teams. And they adapted their routines, changing routes, installing lights or cameras, using escorts. People described the cost in small, accumulative ways: the loss of spontaneity, the narrowing of routes, the rituals that replaced freedom. One woman wrote that she had once loved midnight walks. After an encounter, she now scheduled her walks into a group text, shared her ETA, and asked someone to check in. Another man said he kept an extra set of keys in a different pocket and rehearsed the sound of the lock turning like a prayer. What is also clear across the accounts is the moral burden often placed on the victim: to prove, to explain, to justify protective measures. Many described a moment of questioning themselves. Did I misread it? Did I overreact? Until a physical artifact proved the warning true. Those artifacts were not always dramatic. Sometimes a receipt in an odd place, a smear on the mailbox, an email header showing a familiar IP range. The existence of tangible proof changed the conversation. Without it, fear often met skepticism. There were also quiet, hopeful patterns. Communities organized. Neighbors shared camera footage. Co-workers took turns walking a person to their car. Campus groups revised photo policies. Platform moderators developed better tools to quickly remove doxing content. Some lawyers and counselors offered sliding scale services to those who could not otherwise afford them. People learned to reframe safety not as isolation, but as calibrated locking routines, yes, but also connection. One woman told me the single best thing someone did was to come over without drama and make her tea. I assembled these accounts not to inflame, but to clarify. Patterns repeat in different clothes. The same small details pop up across places and professions because the mechanisms of observation are basic: glass and reflection, light and shadow, the most vulnerable moments of a routine. The remedies are not miraculous. They are deliberate, communal, and procedural. If you recognize a motif in your life, document it. Tell someone. Keep records. Name the feeling aloud. Institutions may move at their own pace. Create your own parallel that prioritizes immediate safety and emotional care. There is no tidy ending to many of these stories. Some concluded with legal action and a measure of relief. Others ended with relocation or changes in work shifts. A few kept the uncertainty alive for months. What stayed with me as I compiled these accounts was not an image of dramatic rescue, but a map of small acts that helped people feel a little safer. A buddy who walked with them, a manager who shifted a roster without asking questions, a neighbor's camera that caught a fragment of movement. Safety, in practice, is less a single fortress than a constellation of small, mutually arranged measures. If this collection has a through line, it is this: the private habits we take for granted, where we buy coffee, which bench we choose at dusk, can be observed and weaponized. And yet, the response need not be only legalese and resignation. People found power in documentation, in community, and in gentle institutional pressures that, slowly, reassembled a margin of safety. I kept writing because each voice seemed to insist on being heard. I saved the small artifacts people trusted me with and, when appropriate, reached out to ask what had finally made a difference to them. Sometimes the answer was technical.
Often, it was simple human presence. A friend who took a walk with you, a manager who believed you, a moderator who acted quickly. These are the modest scaffolds that, built together, make it harder to be isolated. There are more stories. I have a folder with screens and notes I have not yet fully transcribed, names blurred, dates shuffled. I keep thinking of the glass reflection motif, how a shard can show a whole skyline, and how we must learn to read reflections without allowing them to define us. For those of you who recognized yourself in any of these pages, you do not have to go it alone. Document, ask for witnesses, speak plainly to institutions, seek help. Small measures can compound into protection. Tonight, when I close the window and see my own silhouette in the glass, I pause a moment and check the lock twice. The ritual calms me. It is imperfect, but it is mine, a deliberate action against being seen without consent. The stories I collected taught me that adaptation is not capitulation. It is survival with dignity. I will keep listening, keeping records, telling these voices, because anonymity online should not become a permission slip for harm. The thread of being watched runs through neighborhoods and feeds on silence. The best counter is clarity, community, and, when possible, action. I began to notice, as the folder grew, that responses to being watched tended to cluster not by cunning or wealth, but by what I will call capacity, the set of small advantages that make a person easier to protect. Capacity could be a supportive workplace, a landlord who answered texts at odd hours, a neighbor who kept the porch light on, a friend with a reliable car. It could also be resources, money for a lawyer, spare time to document, digital literacy to alter settings. Those things changed outcomes more often than elaborate plans. A person with capacity could convert an unsettling hint into a defensible position. A person without it often had to improvise and hope for luck. Take Lena, for instance. She worked a retail schedule that rotated week to week. After someone left her address in a comment thread, she started sleeping at different houses, cousin's couch, a friend's spare room, until HR quietly offered her a schedule that kept her hours predictable and allowed a coworker to escort her to the subway. She told me later, with a flatness that was part exhaustion and part relief, that what saved her was not a court order, but other people aligning small gestures, a manager who believed her without requiring a police report, a colleague who volunteered to stay late. Lena's story is an example of capacity multiplied by kindness. Contrast that with Amir, who taught at a community college and lived paycheck to paycheck. When a student published photos of him taken outside his apartment, the college's legal team moved slowly. The landlord refused to change the locks without proof of a break-in. Amir could not afford to move. For months, he slept in a locked bathroom because he could not face the idea of an open, empty bedroom. He documented everything as best he could: screenshots, timestamps, descriptions. But documentation is only helpful if there are systems and people ready to use it. Sometimes those systems are bureaucratic and slow. Sometimes the institutions that promise protection are themselves unsure how to act without a clearer legal mandate. The legal landscape is a patchwork. Some jurisdictions have begun to explicitly define doxing as a punishable offense. Others rely on harassment or stalking statutes that were written long before online ecosystems existed. Victims report that police responses vary wildly, from sympathetic officers who take reports and preserve evidence, to those who advise victims to turn off their social media, as if the onus of protection should be solely on the person targeted. Lawyers I spoke with described a familiar dance, an officer who is willing to investigate but hamstrung by evidentiary standards, a prosecutor reluctant to bring charges when the intent is murky, a judge cautious.
About chilling speech. Civil remedies exist, torts for invasion of privacy, injunctions, restraining orders, but they are slow and expensive, and they sometimes expose victims to further scrutiny as details become public in court filings. Platforms, meanwhile, sit in a particular bind. They host the content and the audiences where doxing happens. They also provide the pathways for quick removal and the tools to limit spread. Some companies have made meaningful changes.
faster takedowns for doxing reports, clearer avenues for victims to submit proof, teams trained to spot coordinated harassment. But even where moderation improves, it often feels reactive. Content can be copied and mirrored across accounts, private groups, and less regulated corners of the web faster than moderation can follow. One moderator told me, off the record, that the presence of a documented pattern, screenshots, timestamps, links, was the single most effective thing in persuading the team to act decisively. That reinforces the evidence-first reality I kept encountering. Technical mitigations can help. Two-factor authentication and strong passwords reduce account takeovers. Burner emails and phone numbers can shield contact points. Privacy settings can limit who can see what. But these are not bulletproof, nor are they universally accessible. Some people are reluctant to use extra locks because they fear being locked out of important systems in emergencies. Others find layered security daunting. More importantly, technical measures often treat symptoms, closing a window, rather than the structural dynamics that allow someone to be observed and pursued. They are necessary but insufficient. There is a moral dimension that rarely makes legal code: the responsibility of bystanders. Several stories hinged on whether a person nearby chose to intervene or to ignore a suspicious pattern. In one case, a neighbor noticed a van parked outside for 2 nights and recorded a plate, later providing the photograph to the victim and to the police. In another, a building superintendent dismissed repeated complaints as people being paranoid, and the silence allowed the harassment to escalate. Bystanders can be small levers of safety: a witness who keeps a log, a friend who answers a midnight text, a community group that organizes walking pairs. The ethics of looking, of noticing, becomes complicated when surveillance culture itself normalizes observation. How do we teach people to recognize when attention is exploitative rather than communal? That question loops back to education. I heard from teachers and campus safety officers who had adapted curricula to include digital hygiene, how to manage privacy settings, how to document incidents, how to recognize predatory patterns. These programs, when done well, were practical and destigmatizing. They told students that being targeted is not a moral failure and that there are steps to reduce harm. But education is not universal, and the burden of learning often falls on those already under threat. One of the clearest shifts I observed was cultural, a slow redefinition of what counts as an invasion. 10 years ago, many people treated the leaking of a home address as merely irritating. Today, it is more likely to be recognized as dangerous. That change in social norms matters because it shapes responses. Employers, platforms, and neighbors begin to treat disclosure as something that can and should prompt action. There is a feedback loop. As more institutions act, survivors are likelier to report. As reporting increases, institutions create better workflows. As workflows improve, the environment becomes marginally safer. Still, progress is uneven. The people who fall through the cracks are often those who are simultaneously visible and disenfranchised: local journalists who report on corruption, activists who shine light on powerful interests, sex workers with precarious legal protections, LGBTQ+ individuals in hostile regions. These groups are doubly exposed. The visibility they create is part of their work or identity, and the backlash is both personal and structural. Several organizations are trying to meet these needs with flexible funding, emergency grants that pay for relocation, security audits, or legal help. Those funds can be decisive. They are acts of solidarity translated into resources. I began to think about what a better system might look like. It would be multi-layered: preventative measures that minimize unnecessary exposure, rapid response networks that combine legal, technical, and emotional support, better training for law enforcement, platform policies that prioritize safety, public funding for emergency relocation and counseling. It would also be a cultural shift that reframed curiosity about other people's lives as a potential threat when accompanied by malicious intent. None of these pieces is glamorous. They are paperwork, phones answered at odd hours, trained moderators, and landlords who take threats seriously. There are also narrative responsibilities. Journalists, myself included, must handle sources and stories with care. Publishing a name or detail can amplify harm if not necessary to the account. I found myself making hard choices. A corroborated detail that would add color versus the risk of deepening exposure for someone who asked for anonymity. Those choices are ethics in action. They shape whether visibility is accountability or punishment. Perhaps the most surprising thing I found was the resilience present in small human rituals. A woman who had been targeted began leaving her keys with a neighbor every night and texting one sentence, home or safe, to a group of friends whenever she arrived. Those texts were not about surveillance in the technical sense. They were a social protocol that converted isolation into a network. Another person I spoke to had taken to carrying a worn paperback in a bag. When they felt watched in public, they would hold the book open and breathe for 5 minutes. The act made the world feel less urgent and their own body less of an instrument of panic. Rituals like these are not policy, but they are important. They are ways of reclaiming ordinary life from the machinery of visibility. At the same time, I do not want to romanticize resilience. Coping strategies are not justice. They are survival techniques in a system that often privileges those who least need protection. The goal in any ethical response must be to reduce the need for such extreme self-management.
As winter approached, I convened a small meeting with people I had met over the months: a campus safety coordinator, a platform policy analyst, a lawyer who worked on harassment cases, and 2 survivors who preferred to stay anonymous. We sat around a table in a community center that smelled faintly of coffee and paint, and we talked about practical next steps. The safety coordinator proposed a rapid response kit, templates for documentation, contacts for local legal aid, and routes to emergency housing. The platform analyst offered to pilot a priority review lane for accounts flagged in combination with location disclosures and doxing language. The lawyer sketched a sliding fee plan for injunctions. The survivors asked for something simpler, a hotline staffed by trained listeners who could help someone stay grounded long enough to document and act. We did not produce a miracle. What we drafted looked, on paper, like a series of small scaffolds. But the survivors left the meeting with something else, a plan that acknowledged their full humanity, not only their vulnerability. That, they said, made a real difference. When I left the center that evening, the air had the crispness of a city on the verge of snow. I walked the block slowly, paying attention to the banal details: windows lit in apartments, a dog walker, the green metal bench where a woman always read. The world had its ordinary beauty, and that ordinariness was precisely what needed protection. Back at my apartment, I opened the folder again and began to organize it differently. Up until then, I had sorted by chronology. Now I created categories: immediate actions, institutional responses, legal avenues, emotional care, community practices. I titled a new document Practical Kit, a single sheet that could be printed, folded, and left with someone who needed it at a moment's notice. It included how to screenshot with timestamps, whom to call for immediate accompaniment, sample language for requesting content removal, and a list of small comforts: someone who will bring tea, a warm blanket, a number to text when arriving home. That evening, I mailed copies to a few people who had asked for them and posted a sanitized version on a community bulletin board. I did not imagine it would change policy overnight, but I hoped it might be a compass for someone in a moment of panic. There are no tidy laws of cause and effect here. Some of the narratives I collected end with relief, some with ongoing vigilance, some with quiet heartbreak. But a persistent hope threading through many accounts is that when people are believed and when small, organized measures are available, the world becomes less reckless. Belief is not an abstract kindness. It buys time, and with time, people can make choices that restore a measure of dignity. Tonight, the window is closed, and my silhouette rests against the glass. The ritual of checking the lock remains. I make myself a cup of tea and think of the people who taught me the precise contours of this problem. They taught me that the work of safety is not one big, heroic move, but a slow construction of supports: documentation,
community, responsible platforms, responsive institutions, legal clarity, and the small human acts that say we do not leave one another alone. There will be more to write, more protocols to refine, and more stories to gather. For now, I send the practical kit to a contact in a city 2 hours away who runs an advocacy group. I print extra copies, fold them, and tuck one into the folder. Outside, the street lamp hums. Inside, I make one last note. Follow up with the survivor who preferred to keep their name hidden. They had asked for help finding a counselor who does sliding scale work. It is a small item on a long list, and it feels, somehow, like the right place to start. I made the call before bed. It was short and practical. The counselor's voicemail identified sliding scale hours on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. There was a number to leave a message and a promise of a callback within 48 hours. I left the name of the survivor, the neighborhood, and a request for the counselor to mention that this was an emergency intake for someone experiencing online harassment and safety concerns. I wrote the details into the folder and underlined them twice. The next morning, I began with small, tangible tasks. I folded another sheet of the practical kit and tucked it into a slim envelope marked for immediate use. In the same envelope, I put a handwritten note, not from me, but a script survivors could use. "I need help. Can you stay on the phone until I get home?" A phrase that could be copied into a text or whispered into a voice message. The note was intentionally modest. It needed to be usable in the rawest moment, not poetic or theoretical. By midweek, the pilot with the platform analyst moved from conversation to experiment. We agreed on a simple test. Accounts flagged both for direct threats and for disclosure of a private address or workplace would be routed to a human reviewer within 4 hours. The analyst cautioned that the system would not magically prevent doxing. Automated signal noise and policy thresholds still blocked many cases. Still, 4 hours was far better than the untracked, dormant days most victims endured. We scheduled a review of the pilot's first week and promised to share the metrics with the survivor groups, carefully anonymized. Training for the hotline was slower. There was an enthusiasm that needed shaping, eager volunteers who wanted to be heroes but had little experience holding a line for someone in crisis. The campus safety coordinator led the first session, steady and precise. How to listen without leading, how to document without re-traumatizing, how to keep a caller anchored while resources were summoned. We practiced scripts and silence alike. I watched the volunteers learn the difference between rushing to fix and staying present. It felt like watching a room learning to breathe for someone else. Not every day brought measurable progress. I spent an afternoon on hold with a municipal legal aid intake line while a recorded voice promised a callback never arrived. The lawyer I'd been speaking with sketched an injunction template on the back of a napkin in our next meeting and said plainly that speed mattered more than perfection. "You want the judge to see harm," she said, "not an ideal argument." We turned the napkin outline into a form that could be filled in under pressure. Name, threat, evidence links, and a succinct statement of immediate risk. It was crude, but it could be filed quickly. Small victories came in their own modest ways. A survivor who had been hesitant to seek an emergency shelter texted to say she had found one and felt, for the first time in months, temporarily unmonitored by her harasser. Another person replied to the practical kit with a folded paper of their own, a list of songs that made them breathe, and an instruction to play them aloud whenever panic tightened the chest. I added those songs to the small comfort section under a new heading, Personalized Anchors. We formalized a check-in rhythm. Every Monday, an email went out to the network with a curated list of needs. Volunteers for hotline shifts, donations for bus cards, offers of temporary lodging. Every Friday, the platform analyst sent a digest of cases escalated and removed, anonymized and blunt. The survivor groups held closed forums where strategy and trauma could coexist. Sometimes they were practical, other times they were simply spaces to name grief. There were moments that punctured the momentum. The priority review lane did stop some content quickly, but it also surfaced policy gaps. Content that was harassing but framed as opinion. Images reposted under new captions. Private details repeated in comment threads. The legal system could issue injunctions, but enforcement was uneven and slow. The hotline could hold callers' immediate fear. It could not on its own fix housing insecurity or change workplace protections. Each patch we sewed revealed more at the seam. Still, the scaffolds made a difference. In one case, a survivor used the practical kit to document a pattern of threats. The screenshots, timestamps, and witness statements were enough to secure a temporary restraining order. In another, a volunteer stayed on the line through a 3-hour drive home and then sat with the person in a coffee shop until they were no longer shaking. These were small rescues, not miracles, but they were rescue nonetheless. On a late afternoon in December, with snow beginning to smear the sidewalks into soft gray, I delivered a stack of kits to the advocacy group 2 hours away. We exchanged quiet gratitude, the kind that comes without theatrics, and the leader of the group told me she had already begun training neighborhood liaisons to use the materials. She spoke about layering care, like bricks, each modest and steady. I thought about the bench where the woman always read, and about the neighbor who brought a steaming thermos when someone knocked on his door in the middle of the night. Back home, I checked the locks out of habit. The ritual was a small liturgy. Knob turned, chain latched, a sigh that acknowledged both vulnerability and preparation. I made tea, sat at the table, and opened the folder to the page where I'd listed follow-ups. There were many. Calls, trainings, edits to the kit, conversations to hold with platform engineers who understood algorithms but not fear. Outside, the street lamp hummed in its patient way. Inside, I wrote one more item on the list. Convene a survivors advisory council that would approve every template and every outreach script. For months, we had worked around survivors. It was time to work with them, in the center, not on the margins. The idea felt right in the chest. Not a rescue, but an alignment. I closed the folder, folded the sheet once more, and placed it in the drawer where I kept the other small things that mattered. A worn bus card, a list of crisis numbers, a pen that had been given to me by a volunteer who stayed for a year. The work would not end, and there would be setbacks and bureaucratic dead ends. But when I turned off the kitchen light and leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, there was a sense of a different currency at work. Not the illusion of a single sweeping reform, but the gradual accounting of care that keeps someone alive and able to choose again. I drank the last of my tea, and after a minute went to bed with the drawer closed and the folder within reach. If the night brought a call, I wanted to be ready. If the night brought nothing, I wanted to be rested enough to answer the one that would come tomorrow. The list on my desk waited, patient and long, a map of small commitments. Outside, the city exhaled snow. Inside, I breathed with it.